There are currently 170 League of Legends champions in Arena, and I have played every single one of them. If I were to spend a minute talking about each one, this video would be about 3 hours long. In order to prevent that and make this video more manageable for everyone, I'll be breaking up the champions into the categories that League has set up for Arena. Now we are about to rate all 37 mages in Arena and talk about their buffs and nerfs, but before we do that, let's talk about what augments and items they excel with, as honestly, it's what makes the mage class kind of broken. There are honestly so many augments that are so good with mages, so I'll try to speedrun them. For silvers, you have Wishful Thinking for a free 70 AP, you have Overflow because who needs mana when your enemies are one-shot. When it comes to gold augments, you have Big Ring to get an OP shield that doesn't decay over time, from beginning to end to farm gold with Burst and First Strike to scale, Marks Mage to suddenly deal insane physical damage on every single one of your autos, Phenomenal Evil to gain stupid amounts of AP throughout the game, Vulnerability to make your damage over time effects crit, which includes something like Brand or Malzahar. And then it doesn't stop there because we have Prismatics, where you have Accelerating Sorcery, because who needs one-shots when you have infinite casts, Chain Lightning to enhance your Wombo combo, Eureka for insane initial ability haste, Infernal Conduit, not for the damage, but amazing CDR on basic abilities, Jeweled Gauntlet, because who needs infinite casts when you one-shot, the Quest Wooglet's Witch Cap, because who needs infinite casts when you have insane AP, and OP Zhonya's. And finally, Ultimate Revolution, if your ultimate is oppressive and you want to have it twice. Now that being said, there's definitely going to be some augments I have missed, as there are so many, so feel free to let me know in the comments which ones you really like for mages. And of course, the augments that are just OP in general are going to still be good for mages, like Apex Inventor or Wisdom of Ages. Now the fun doesn't stop there, because mages have some of the best items in Arena. Now again, there are potentially so many, so I'm going to do my best to list the ones I consider actually OP. For legendaries, Liandry's is one of the best items in the game, and even though it's crazy nerfed in terms of AP, the percent health damage is the best stat in the game, with your Arena stat adjustments giving everyone more HP. Rite of Ruin is a nutty item if you cast often and have any crit, as the shields you get become insane. In terms of prismatic items, Demonic Embrace is nutty as it gives you percent AP that scales when you are low. Innervating Locket has the potential to give you 320 AP at level 18. Pyromancer's Cloak always pumps out insane damage and gives you Omnivamp, which is super nice for the mage class. Reality Fracture spawns constant damage and skill shot blockers. Runecarver is a potentially infinite scaling damage outputter if you can poke and kite. And finally, Gambler's Blade is sneaky strong on champs like Brand and Malzahar, as the burn will constantly have a chance to give you gold procs, so if you don't need a strong prismatic, you can just become super duper rich if you're able to win a round. Items on mages are kind of bonkers, which is why the class overall feels so strong, and they all have potential. But let's talk about which ones I feel have more potential than others. First champion we have Ahri, who has some increases to her W, giving her more movement speed, giving her some more damage. Her charm cooldown is lowered, and the nice thing is that on her ultimate, now she gets 2 additional recasts per takedown instead of the usual 1. And I'm going to put Ahri in the strong tier. What I like about Ahri is that she can be very versatile. You can build her more bruisery, which we are seeing now actually in Summoner's Rift, where you go like Liandry's, Rod of Ages, just a bunch of health items. And like we were saying, Liandry's is just such a solid and one of the best mage items in Arena because percent health damage is just the best stat. So Ahri is really nice there. If you do high roll something like Jeweled Gauntlet or just a bunch of AP, you can go for more of an assassin, just straight up burst build with Ahri, which is also really nice. She's one of the best users of Marks Mage because her auto attacks feel really good. She has natural kite ability with her CC, with her high movement speed. And all these reasons is why she's going to go in the strong tier. Now, the one downside of Ahri is that she's not the best champion at killing tanks. It can take her a while, and when her ultimate is down, she can feel rather weak and easy to blow up. So she's a very ult-reliant champion, but as long as you can manage that well, she's going to perform pretty well. Anivia only has one change that I saw, which was on her passive being reset every round. And Anivia is an interesting one because she's super good with Liandry's, but she's just super immobile, which does really suck for her. I'm going to end up putting her in the has potential but awkward / hard tier, because there will be some games where she does feel really oppressive, but it does kind of rely on the enemy team being immobile because she can struggle against champions that can get on top of her or avoid her ultimate. She's good like when the zone gets smaller, but also sometimes she does lack the burst to actually end up winning the fight. So sometimes she can suck in that regard. She's pretty vulnerable if enemy champions have a bunch of CC, because if they're on top of her, she doesn't have the best chances of kiting for herself. So she can also struggle there. Like every champion in Arena, there are some that feel absolutely amazing, but oftentimes on Anivia, you will find yourself kind of frustrated just because of how much mobility there is in the game. And she also struggles against like long range enemy team comps because her range is more in the mid tier, I would say, like being more mid-range champion. So long range poke or marksman with a lot of range can also be a bit of a trouble for Anivia. Annie's one of those champions that absolutely dominated Arena when it first came out, which is why pretty much every single one of her abilities are nerfed. Starting with her passive duration has been decreased, which is nice because she was very annoying to deal with when she just stunned you and your teammate a billion times, especially for like how long she could stun you. Her Q damage is reduced, her W damage is reduced, and her Tibbers health has been changed to 50% of the value, which is super duper nice because there's only 2 people that are able to hit the Tibbers. So if it was at its full health value, it would just take forever to kill it. The damage has also been reduced on it. And she absolutely belongs in the strong but very nerfed tier. She literally has all of her abilities besides her E nerfed, including her passive, so it kind of makes sense that she doesn't go in the higher tiers. Because Annie, actually kind of similarly to Anivia, can struggle against champions with a bunch of range. She can struggle against champions that have a bunch of mobility. I just think that she still is better than Anivia, which is why she has nerfs, is because she can do a better job at bursting people. Her CC is less conditional, where Anivia like has to land her Q stun, while a lot of Annie's CC will be point and click. She's a pretty good champion when it comes to like wombo comboing people with her ultimate stun and like just trying to layer as much damage on top of that. But if you're not blowing people up with Annie, sometimes you'll find that you just get absolutely smashed faster than you can smash them. Aurelion Sol is an interesting champion, and he does have some changes where he gains passive Stardust per round. He has more burst damage from his Q. He has lower cooldown on his W, and his E cooldown, I believe, is also lowered. And he's going in the solid but awkward tier. Honestly, there are some games where Aurelion Sol will feel like an absolute menace, and he is nice where he's scaling into the game more and more. The thing is, he doesn't have any hard CC, which like Anivia has, but he is better than Anivia because he does feel like he has more consistent damage, but he does have the same problems just as a lot of mages will have, where they just don't have the best mobility in the world. He does have some with his W. He is nice where he is scaling into the game. He is nice where he has that percent target maximum health. But there are some games where your damage will just almost be like out-sustained sometimes, or like tanks will be just too tanky for you to finish them off before they CC you to death and blow you up with their teammates' damage. He will also, of course, struggle against champions with a bunch of range. He can struggle sometimes against champions with too much burst. Sure, you can go something like Zhonya's, which is nice, but even then, they'll sometimes just be able to outwait your Zhonya's cooldown and jump on you again. He is going to have some good games, though, which is why he's solid, but he definitely can feel awkward because his mobility is a bit more contingent to use, not as snappy as a lot of the other mobility spells in League of Legends. Aurora is a new champion in the game who I didn't see any buffs or nerfs to, and I'm going to put her in the decent tier. And admittedly, I've only played one game of Aurora to fulfill my condition of playing every single champion before I rate them, so I'm going to say that my confidence in rating her isn't the highest. The reason why I'm not going to put her any higher than decent, because even though she does have amazing mobility, I think Aurora's strength really comes from the fact that she's a lane bully, like especially in pro play from what I see. So being a lane bully is not the best archetype in Arena. Usually you want to be better as like a skirmisher, which she isn't the worst at either. But if you're on a even playing field as everybody else, Aurora can sometimes feel a bit lackluster. She has decent burst, but I think she can struggle against bursting champions that are a bit more tanky than normal, thanks to the Arena set adjustments. Even like a champion just buying a couple anvils and maybe getting some MR anvils randomly could really hurt Aurora's damage. She's also like really powerful in team fights because her ultimate can hit 5 people, and now it's only hitting 2 people, and it doesn't do the most damage in the world. She's also rather squishy, so if you get on top of her, if you CC her a bunch, she can struggle. She does have an interesting like on-hit passive, so maybe you could even like explore a bit of a more on-hit build. I do think she has some nice versatility. She does, again, have a bit of mobility, a bit of safety in her kit, which is nice, and so I do think she is rather decent. She's going to be better the better you are at Aurora, as every single champion on this list is going to be, and I wouldn't be surprised if she is actually better than I think, but because she can struggle against long range poke, she can struggle against ADCs who are able to out-sustain her damage or just pump out more damage than she does. I don't think that she is the best. Azir is a champion that has a bunch of buffs. His cooldown on his Q is decreased. His on-hit on his W is increased. Like, for instance, the on-hit and on-attack effectiveness is changed to 100%, which is nice. You could explore a more on-hit build with Azir. He has more base AP damage. He has more AP ratio on a lot of his abilities. His R cooldown is reduced. So there is a good chance you'll be able to get 2 ultimates off, especially if you're hitting some power flowers. And Azir is the perfect champion to be in has potential, but awkward / hard tier. If you're really good at Azir, then, like, why are you not playing in the LCS? Because this champion is kind of busted if you're really, really good at him. He's not the easiest champion. You do kind of have to position well. You have to, like, play around chokes well. So if champions are able to ignore the fact that you're trying to keep him in a choke, he can be awkward to play. Like many other mages, he can struggle against champions with a lot of mobility. The nice thing about Azir is that his E in combination with his Q gives him, like, actually a bunch of mobility on his own. He has nice peel with his ultimate. He has pretty good DPS and sustained damage with his W. Like, I could easily see him being in these higher tiers, and if you're playing against a really good Azir, it's going to be quite a struggle for you. It's just that you do have to play him super duper well. I'm actually going to end up putting him in the solid but awkward tier, which is funny because this is a re-recording, right? Because the audio was messed up the first time. And I've played against Azir's a couple times since I made my original recording of this, and he has done better than I expected. Just nobody really ever plays him. And even when I played him, I could see the potential of him. I could see that he can do well in pumping out a bunch of damage. I think he's not the biggest fan of prismatic lobbies where there's, like, a bunch of burst because of the prismatic augments, or there's, like, a bunch more CDR and stuff like that, because he kind of wants a slower, more controlled fight, as he really excels in that. So there is a lot of RNG kind of involved with Azir. You want the game and the opponents you're facing about to be a bit more slow pace, and if that's the case, he will excel a lot more. Now, Brand is pretty heavily nerfed, but he has % health damage from his passive, and he's going to the OP tier automatically. If you've played Arena, there's not really much I have to say about this. You know how OP Brand is. He's also so stupidly easy, where you just kind of spam press your QWE towards the direction of the enemies. It's not the hardest thing ever to land. You're just going to be proccing your Liandry super easily. He's one of the best mages at proccing, like, everything that exists for mages, for champions in general, because of his burn. He's really good with, like, Infernal Conduit, because then he just has no CDR anymore. And sure, his AP ratios are reduced, but, like, who cares? Brand is kind of just a vessel to constantly proc Liandry's. And his Blaze, he's also kind of naturally tanky because he can build more health items, because, again, he doesn't really care too much about having too much AP, as his passive doesn't even scale with AP. It just naturally does the max health damage. One thing that's really important is building anti-heal, and a lot of champions don't want to do that because it's not the best item to buy, but Brand doesn't care if he has to buy it. As long as he has Liandry's, he can buy other items that really suit his need. He can comfortably buy, like, Zhonya's if he's really desperate for it. He can build something like Rylai's if he needs to slow the enemies. He can struggle against champions with a bunch of mobility. He can struggle against champions that have, like, infinite CC, or champions that have, like, a ton of burst, or champions with a bunch of range, but what champions don't struggle in those cases? Now, even though Brand is in the OP tier, it doesn't mean they're going to win every single game on him, but there are going to be very few games that you don't end up doing pretty well with on Brand, even if you're not the best Brand player. And don't be surprised if he's constantly banned, because he can get kind of annoying and frustrated to play against because he is so brain dead powerful. He's also really fun to play as, admittedly. So I limit the number of times I play Brand because it is kind of lame to constantly play the same champion. I advocate for having a good champion diversity, so I would encourage you try to limit the number of games of Brand you're spamming out, because it does get kind of stale rather quickly. And I don't really know how Riot could nerf him even more without him just being, like, unclickable, because Brand really shows you just how powerful % maximum health damage is in a game mode where everybody just has more natural health so they don't get blown up normally. Cassio is another champion that has a bunch of nerfs. One thing that's interesting is that you can't buy boots on Cassio, so you can buy 2 of the same starting item, which is pretty interesting to see. I think the only champion in the game who can buy 2 of the same item right now. That's more of an interesting fact than actually super duper relevant. Her damage in general is pretty nerfed. Her W cooldown is super duper high. At rank 1, it's all the way up to 28 seconds, and it only goes to 20 seconds. Now, that all being considered, she is still quite strong, especially as an anti-melee champion. A more extreme example of Brand, where she's weak against long-range poke, she can be weak against certain assassins, she can be weak against certain marksmen, because Brand still has kind of decent range with his Q and W. So because of the nerfs, I'm going to put Cassio in the strong but very nerfed tier. There will be some fights where you just absolutely melt the person, especially if you're able to get some of the strong augments that want you just to be casting very often. Cassio is very strong in those cases, one of the best mages, but because she can struggle to get on top of people, she doesn't go in the higher tiers for me. Fiddlesticks is a champion that I assumed would receive some changes in Arena, but I haven't seen any. If you know he has some, feel free to let me know in the comments below, as well as any champion. Like, I'm using the wiki and I hope it's accurate, and it seems to be because, like, for instance, the patch notes have been added to it, but who knows, like, it is so hard to tell because League of Legends kind of hides the information. Getting back to Fiddlesticks, one thing that's really nice about him is his Q is such a powerful single target CC. It lasts a super long time, and during that time you can have your teammate pump out a lot of damage. You can heal with Fiddlesticks using his W. His ultimate is very powerful if you're able to channel it on top of somebody. The problem is it can get cancelled by CC. It can be dashed out of by enemy champions, so that kind of sucks. For these reasons, I'm going to put him in the solid but awkward tier. His Q alone is enough to keep him from being in the has potential but awkward / hard tier, because point and click CC is very, very powerful, especially in Arena, because there's only 2 people you need to worry about, so if you can shut down one person for a while, it is quite nice. That being said, his damage outside of his ultimate is a bit lackluster, so you're kind of relying on that. He can struggle against tanks if they build anti-heal, because that is the way he survives and tries to hope to beat them. But oftentimes he doesn't have actually enough damage to beat the super duper tanks or the champions with a bunch of CC in order to win the round. Like Annie, Heimerdinger was an absolute menace when Arena first came out, and he has received several nerfs. The biggest one is that his turrets in general have 70% of their normal health, and they do a lot less damage than they normally would. He struggles even more than normally against champions with a lot of AoE, because they can pretty easily just clear out all of his turrets. He is still really annoying if you're playing melee champions, because he is so good at proccing Liandry's a bunch of times. His W is actually also buffed, but not enough for me to put him any higher than the strong but very nerfed tier. He's now just really specialized to be an anti-melee champion, but because of the nerfs, he actually can still sometimes struggle against those people if they are rolling really good augments, and they're able to out-sustain the damage he pumps out from Liandry's being constantly applied by his turrets. Hwei is another champion that I didn't see any changes to. I think it's more of a symptom of them being relatively new to the game mode in general. I believe Hwei, like, just came out in Arena 3.0, like, near the tail end of it. And I'm going to put Hwei in the decent tier because he is pretty decent. He has a bunch of AoE. He's surprisingly fast with his empowered W, the one that gives him movement speed. He has a bunch of AoE, which makes him really good at proccing Liandry's. He can just be a bit lackluster if the enemy champions are able to jump on top of him because he has no mobility, and he doesn't pump out the same damage that Brand does naturally, so if you build more defensive on Hwei, he just doesn't hit the same, so you do kind of need to build him like a glass cannon. You have to, like, position really well, you have to use your own CC really well to peel, you have to have your teammate peel really well, and if all of those conditions are met, he can win some games, but it is definitely going to be an uphill battle. Karma's an interesting champion because she's so versatile. You can play her fully supportive, you can play her fully as a burst mage, you can play her as a mix of the two, you can even play her as, like, a tanky style by just playing around her empowered W, healing you based on your percent health that's missing. I'm going to put her in the strong tier. She's honestly really fun if you like playing enchanters but actually want to be, like, consistently useful, and just the fact that she has such a variety of builds you can go for is quite enjoyable. It's something I really like because you never really know where you're going to get when you load into the game, you can really adapt your playstyle based on the augments that you get. The one thing about Karma is that unless you do hit the really powerful augment, she's not gonna wow you too much. Her damage can sometimes feel lackluster. Her shielding doesn't feel the most powerful because it does usually get enhanced by the fact that there's 5 people she can, like, for instance, shield with her ultimate shield. So she's definitely a solid pick in almost all games that you're going to play. She can struggle a bit against super long range ADCs. She can struggle a bit against super long range mages. But against bruisers and tanks, she's one of the best mages at peeling for her teammate or just consistently trying to pump out damage without dying. Karthus is a unique champion because in League of Legends, he's pretty much only a jungler at this point. Sometimes he will show up as a bot laner because his playstyle is just farm, super duper fast, get ahead of the enemies, and then with that advantage, win the game. But in Arena, where everybody has the same amount of gold and the same levels, he definitely doesn't feel that great. So what they did is they buffed his damage a ton, especially on his ultimate, where they gave him 30% more AP scaling. They increased the base damage a bunch, and they reduced the ultimate cooldown but from 200 seconds at rank 1 to 60 seconds, and it's always 60 seconds, so you are able to get multiple ults off if you like ult at the very beginning of the fight, and then you take down the power flower. There's going to be some games where you might be able to one-shot or almost one-shot the enemies by using your ultimate, but you have to really high roll. If you play Karthus and you're really good at landing Qs on champions that are fast, then Karthus is definitely going to feel better. But because champions in general in Arena just feel faster, especially like with having Flee naturally, I believe champions might actually have more movement speed naturally, now that I think about it. I think ranged champions do, so landing those Qs can be a bit tricky. You can't rely on having like exhaust to slow them to make your Qs easier, so he's going to go in the has potential but awkward / hard tier. He's a champion that relies on landing his Qs to do the damage he wants to be dealing, and he has no mobility, so if the enemy champions are able to jump on him, blow him up, he will feel kind of useless. He is a sneaky, fun champion if you really high roll, but unless you really high roll, he is quite a miserable champion to play. Kayle. What an absolute monster when Arena first came out. She's an interesting champion because she's one of the best hybrid scaling champions with AD and AP, and when Arena first came out, there was a bunch of items that scaled really well with AD and AP, so if you had like a hybrid scaling build, Kayle was absolutely amazing. That being said, she has so many augments that are so powerful with her. If you have like anything that buffs her attack speed, buffs her on hits, Kayle is an absolute menace. Now, she does have a ton of nerfs, which keeps her in check unless she hits those augments. And then if she hits those augments, she is... But if she hits those conditions, if she hits those augments, she's easily in the OP tier. But it is conditional on her augments and items being the right ones, because she does have enough nerfs at the moment that if you aren't hitting the things you want to be hitting, she does feel a bit lackluster, but there are so many game states that you will be able to hit those conditions. And the fact that she does have an ultimate which makes a champion immune to damage is a very powerful ability. Sometimes, though, you can still beat them because she just won't have enough damage to win even with an invincibility, so she can struggle against tanks sometimes. But again, with the right augments, with the right items, nothing will matter. She will just win the game if you're not able to CC her and blow her up pretty much instantly. I think Kennen's a cool champion in Arena because you have this dream of like absolutely blowing up both people with his ultimate. But that gameplay is kind of toxic because if Kennen is good, he's just going to win the fight really fast by flash ulting on top of you. So what they did is they pretty heavily nerfed his ultimate. They also nerfed the AP ratio on his W, but they did give it more AD ratio. And Kennen is kind of cool where you could go for an on-hit build because your E gives you a bunch of attack speed. He just doesn't have the most range, so he can kind of struggle with that playstyle. Because of his heavy nerfs to his ultimate, I'm going to put him in the strong but very nerfed tier. I think Kennen has been put in check unless you really do hit these very powerful breakpoints with great augments, great items, that he can feel a bit lackluster. Now, he still does have a great ultimate, it just does less damage, but it can be very impactful if you get them into it for a long period of time. If your teammate has a lot of wombo combo, you can still go for an interesting strategy, but if the enemies are like way too tanky, it's going to feel lackluster, or if they have just too much kite, he doesn't really do too much without his flash. Lissandra is a champion I didn't find any nerfs or buffs to, and she's one of my personal favorites. She's one of my favorite supports to actually play as like an off-meta support, because her ultimate is so powerful at locking down one person. She has pretty good CC with her W. That being said, her Q, W, E, and R just do no damage in Arena. A lot of her damage comes from her passive, actually. And because there's only one time you get the passive, that kind of sucks. She just doesn't do any percent health damage. She's a bit short range. She isn't that tanky without Aftershock. Like when you play support Lissandra, you really want Aftershock to survive when you go in. Even when you play a mid lane Lissandra, oftentimes you'll go Aftershock. Because of those weaknesses, she's actually going to go in the bad tier. I'm really sad that this is the case because I really like playing Lissandra and I want her to do well. Just every time I play her, I'm just really underwhelmed. I go in, I ult somebody, and it's like, oh wow, I did 15 damage, it feels like, because everybody just has so much more health with the arena stat adjustments. I really do think that Lissandra could deserve a bit of love, just a little bit more base damage, so that she can feel like she can compete in this mode. After all, when was the last time you actually lost to a Lissandra in Arena? I mean, like, if she even became that big of a menace, you could end up just building QSS to get rid of her ultimate. So there's definitely going to be some counterplay to playing this champion, and I do think she could use a little bit of love. And just because everybody is tankier and she isn't tanky enough to be that interesting peel engaged champion, she definitely does struggle. Speaking of supports, we have Lux, who used to be always a mid laner and now more often shows up in the support role. All of her abilities have been buffed, and these are kind of the buffs I would want to see from Lissandra. None of them are that crazy, it's just enough to help her output some damage. Now with Lux, you do have more counterplay because Lissandra is a kind of point-and-click champion, so I can understand that would be toxic if she was actually good. And with Lux, you're going to have to be good at landing your skill shots, because if you do, she will do some damage. Not the most damage, but she will do decent damage, especially against squishies. She's one of those mages that I was talking about that would be good against like Cassiopia, against Heimerdinger, against Karma, because if you are able to play safe, if you're able to use your range, if you're able to peel with your teammate, she can be a bit of a nuisance. I'm going to put her in the decent tier because she's not the best champion at proccing, for instance, like Liandry's, as these champions will more easily just proc it by randomly throwing out spells. Well, at least Hwei, definitely, because you can, at the end of the day, dodge Lux's abilities, especially because you have more mobility in general, and she can struggle against champions that have a bunch of dashes, because once they're on top of you, Lux can have a hard time getting away because she has no real mobility on her own. Malzahar is a champion that I expected a bunch of nerfs to, and he does have a change, but it's actually a buff to his Voidlings, where they deal more percent AD damage. And I'm going to put Malzahar in the OP tier. I think he's one of the best champions with the really strong augments, with the really strong items, because if you put E on top of people, it will just constantly proc the things you want to be proccing with the items, with the augments. And I think League of Legends kind of forgot that the burn champions are just way too strong with certain items, with certain augments, so that if these champions hit those things, they are way too oppressive, and it's not that hard because there's so many that are really good on mages at the moment. His ultimate is just also way better than Lissandra because sure, it can be interrupted, but if one of the enemy champions is like away at the moment, trying to get like power flowers or escape, then his ultimate's very strong. It also does percent health damage, which is super duper nice, as Lissandra's, I believe, doesn't. And he's way better at proccing Liandry's because you just put your E on top of people and it constantly will be ticking. His Voidlings are actually really annoying if you're playing a poke champion because they'll just constantly be blocking it, especially in the maps with a lot of terrain. His Voidlings will just like clog up the entire space. And they're also good because in the fights, they'll just be hitting the champions way more often because everything's more tight and enclosed. And yeah, I think Malzahar is very strong. He's also super duper easy to play. He has a natural black shield that the enemies have to pop, which is nice. And there's only 2 people that need to pop it, so if they don't have any poke, he can be quite a nuisance to deal with. And I definitely think it's a champion that Riot can maybe consider nerfing in the future, because I do think he's a bit too powerful, especially considering just how easy he is to play. Mel is the newest champion League of Legends, and she actually already has some changes. She has buffs to her passive, where the base damage has been increased, and what's super duper nice is that the rebuttal, the ability that reflects other abilities, is cooldown has been reduced by 15 seconds at rank 1, because normally it's 35 seconds, and now it's 20 seconds, which is still a long time, but at least you are more likely to get at least 2 procs of it off, or maybe even 3 in a longer fight with Mel, which is nice. I'm going to put her in the strong tier. She's definitely one of those champions that's going to be hard for me to rate, because the only times I've played Mel are in Arena, and I've now played her twice because League of Legends loves giving me her when I click the ultimate bravery mode. Honestly, kind of hate playing Mel because she just has a billion lines of text, which, I mean, I have read several times, but my ADHD self is just like, it's so hard for me to process what's going on, and she's not my playstyle of champion. She doesn't interest me that much, so pretty much what you do is you just want to be pumping out your damage, and eventually they will get executed if you have enough of your stacks on them or something. I don't know. The reason why she's going in strong tier is because I am a terrible Mel player. I can clearly tell that, but I just spam my abilities constantly on top of them. I run around, I use my reflect when it's a good time to use it. I press my R, and I'm just doing good amounts of damage and proccing Liandry's super easily with my Q. And that's pretty much enough just to give a mage strong tier, because she can constantly proc Liandry super easily, and she uses the OP mage items and augments very well. She's not going higher because she just doesn't have any mobility, so if you do jump on top of her, she can be squishy enough to blow up. Longtime fans of the channel will know that Morgana is my least favorite champion in the entire game, but honestly, as the game has progressed, that's becoming less and less true, just because every champion has a billion mobility, so Morgana Q feels weaker and weaker over time, and in Arena, Morgana Q is actually nerfed to have an even longer cooldown. It does really suck to be hit by this ability, but even if she has like a spam Q strategy, you can get the combo breaker, so she can't lock you up forever, which is nice, and she just doesn't do enough damage consistently for me to put her any higher than decent tier. She's definitely decent because her W can proc Liandry super duper easily. The champion itself is pretty easy. You can play it alongside something else that's really strong to kite to engage for them, which is nice. Just put Black Shield on a super duper OP champion and let them carry the fight for you. You can also build her full AP, but she can be a bit lackluster if you do that. And because you can miss her essential ability, which is her Q, her ultimate can be like flashed away from at the last second, so it doesn't land the stun. She is not the hardest champion to outplay, especially because all champions are also faster with the arena stat adjustments, that she's only going to go in the decent tier. Another versatile champion is Neeko, who has been buffed many times. And what's cool is you can build her full AP, or you could even look to go an on-hit build with Neeko, which can be pretty powerful if you hit the right augments. And I really like that. I'm going to put her in the decent tier. The thing is, she's not the best on-hit champion, and she's not the best full burst mage champion. She doesn't have any natural percent health damage, I believe. Her ultimate, again, can struggle from the fact that enemies have flash more often than not, so they can get away from that. When Neeko is really good in like pro play, it's when she hits a 5-man ult and then the team can follow her up. It's pretty rare where she's the one who does a 5-man ult and like that's enough damage to actually win the fight, especially when everybody's more tanky. It's more that she's a great setup champion from the mid lane role. And in Arena, you usually want champions that do a lot of damage to win the fight than just like set something up, unless you have another champion that's really OP. And she's also like not tanky enough to be that amazing engaged champion, because you're not really gonna flank from out of vision that often, as the enemy champions kind of know who to pay attention to. There's only 2 people you really have to focus on. There's not 5 people you have to worry about like getting flanked on. So again, Neeko can struggle in those circumstances. But because of her versatility and because she can do the engage, she can do the on-hit, she can poke if she wants to, she's going to go in the decent tier. Orianna is another wombo combo legend, but it's more that she puts the ball on her teammate, they go in, and then she's able to apply a bunch of damage and that CC, which is rather nice. She does have some changes where I believe she gets a little bit more health growth. Her on hits are actually buffed, but I don't think on hit Orianna is the best unless you have Mark's Mage, of course, then. And her WAP is actually nerfed because Orianna does have decent AoE damage. Originally I had Orianna in the solid but awkward tier because sometimes you could like miss ultimate, it could get flashed away from. But it is kind of hard to actually flash away from Orianna that effectively, and the cooldown isn't that long where it's not too ridiculous to think that you might get 2 ultimates off. So I'm going to put her in the strong tier because there are some games where you have like a Vi going in with a bunch of damage, and then the Orianna ult is just enough to keep them close to the Vi so the Vi can finish them off, and the Orianna ult also does decent damage, so you're able to pop somebody. There's a lot of champions you can do this with, like Xin Zhao would be another good one, Volibear. She's just a really good champion to enhance the play style of somebody else. And the fact that she doesn't have to go in like a Kennen or a Neeko is super duper nice, even like Lissandra, so she can play from far away while still enabling her teammate really well with decent damage on top of that. She can build Liandry's super duper easily. She can even go for like more defensive stats like Zhonya's, as she's a great champion to enable another damage dealer better than just being the solo damage dealer on your team. And because she has that nice playstyle, she's going to go in this tier. Ryze is a champion that didn't have any nerfs or buffs until this latest patch, where they're changing the AP ratio from 10% to 7.5% on his Arcane Mastery. And he's going in the augment item OP tier, because, man, Ryze with, like, Overflow, Ryze with items that give him a bunch of mana, which there are just a bunch with the Prismatic Anvils that are also really, really strong. Ryze with any augments where you just want to be constantly spamming abilities, he's super duper good on. He's kind of like Cassiopia in that regard, but he has better range. He has hard CC that's point and click. He also just feels tankier in general. Ryze can feel very powerful. He's not going in the OP tier, though, because you do have to kind of play him well, where you don't just want to, like, blindly go in there and pump out all of your spells that, like, Brand can honestly do most of the time, where Brand just needs to, like, press REQW and then pray that that's enough damage with Liandry's to win the fight. While Ryze, you kind of, like, have to be careful against champions with way too much CC. You have to be careful against champions with way too much range. You can kind of struggle against some ADCs. But with the right items, with the right augments, this champion feels like an absolute menace, and his recent nerf is definitely deserved. If he had more mobility, he would be even more of a nightmare, but thankfully you can sometimes kite him if he allows you to. Swain's another champion that's been recently nerfed, where he gets less health from his soul fragments. They also nerfed his damage from his ultimate, as well as the heal a little bit, which is actually interesting because the damage is still buffed on his ultimate compared to his Summoner's Rift form. And Swain is going to go in the strong tier for me. I actually thought Swain was going to be a lot more nerfed. My guess is that when Arena first came out, it was the, like, older Swain version, maybe. I mean, his reworks are always, like, not that impactful, so I don't actually fully remember that off the top of my head. Swain is one of the best appliers to Liandry's, which is why he is going in the strong tier for me. Honestly, he does belong in the augment / item OP tier because he is similar to Ryze, to Kayle, even to Malzahar, where if you want to be constantly proccing a certain augment or item, Swain's going to be one of the best champions to do that because of his ultimate constantly being able to proc damage. Even his Q is on a low cooldown. The things he does struggle against is range, against high burst damage, but Swain can also build pretty defensively, where he is harder to burst, which is really, really nice for that champion. Swain is very oppressive against, like, tanks or bruisers that don't do enough damage, because he will constantly be having his ultimate up, especially with rallies. If you can just keep him in the zone, he'll just be perma-ulted for the fight, and sometimes he will just absolutely drain tank you until you lose the round. Sylas is an interesting mage because he kind of plays more like a bruiser, and they did nerf the cooldown on his W where it is longer, but I believe they did buff the damage on it. It's kind of hard to tell, but that's the only change to him. And he's going in the augment item OP tier, mostly because of his passive and how great it is with, like, Mark's Mage or anything that just wants to constantly being procced. Like, also Phenomenal Evil he's absolutely busted with because his passive, for some reason, constantly procs it, and he gets so many charges of it that he can become an absolute menace. If you're hitting some of these augments, it's pretty realistic to win an entire game without any deaths, or like one death. I've seen that way too many times, which is why Sylas is going in this tier. even if you're not hitting those super duper OP augments, he's still really good with like Earthwake or any augment that buffs his dashes. I talk about these champions that are like struggle against champions that have so many dashes, and Sylas can have a lot of them. If an enemy champion has really good ults, then Sylas has really good ults, and more often than not, champions will have good ults. He's probably honestly the weakest against really powerful ADCs. Like for instance, like Jhin is really good against him. Like Caitlyn can actually be pretty decent against them because their ultimates kind of suck actually. And Sylas doesn't really care about stealing them. And if they're able to dodge away from his E and his W, they could potentially one-shot him. So for those reasons, he's not going in the OP tier because he is a bit reliant on hitting good items and augments. But if you do, he is an absolute menace. Syndra is a champion I expected to have some nerfs because her ultimate is really good single target damage, but she actually only technically has a buff where she gets some extra splinters per round, which can then upgrade her other abilities. And I'm going to put her in the top of Strong tier. I guess the reason why she doesn't have more nerfs is because she's already pretty heavily nerfed because she's so good in pro play if she's ever meta, because her QE stun is actually a really powerful skill. The thing is, if you do miss it and the enemy champions are able to jump on you, you are toast because you yourself don't have any natural mobility. So she is a pretty high risk champion, but her EQ combo, that stun, it's just so big range. It's so good at knocking away champions, and she has so much potential single target damage where she can really shine. She's probably the weakest against like super duper tanky champions, which is why she's not going any higher in this tier list. But if you are able to full combo onto a squishy target, you can absolutely annihilate them. And if you are playing against really menacing tanks, then you could like try to go for Liandry's burn build and hope that you can just shred them over time. But that could be more optimistic than actually happening. Taliyah is another really strong pro play champion, but she is buffed in this mode where she just deals more damage and her W has reduced cooldown. I'm just gonna put her in the decent tier because she is really good against dash champions where she can stun them, especially because the map is pretty tight, so she can be quite annoying to deal with in that case. She's really good at constantly proccing Liandry's. The thing with Taliyah though that does suck is she doesn't really have an ultimate that matters, and that is a pretty big downside for the champion, because in Arena you do want to have a good ultimate, and Taliyah just simply doesn't have one. So it's kind of impressive that the rest of her abilities are so powerful that she still belongs at the top of decent for me, just because she's such a good counter to dash champions where there are so many, and she's good in those tight choke maps where there are several. She's going to perform worse on the more open maps where champions can just walk away from her E, and she's going to struggle against champions with a lot of range. But against short range champions and champions with a lot of dashes, Taliyah is a very strong champion. If you've played Arena enough times and you see the champion Twisted Fate, what you're seeing is a champion with no items in inventory as he's going for a stat anvil run. Now, that being said, I actually don't think that's the best way to play Twisted Fate on average, because I think the items are pretty good. I mean, okay, with the anvil runs, it really depends on what anvils you're getting. If you're high rolling and getting really, really good anvils, like magic penetration, like straight AP, like fortune anvils, of course, any prismatic anvils, then Twisted Fate is amazing. I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but the reason why you are seeing Twisted Fate being the champion that is going for these anvil runs is because of his new passive, where he gains gold based on how much damage he is dealing to champions. So you gain gold that's based on from 2% to 8% of the damage he is dealing, and it says it's biased towards 8%, so you're more likely going to high roll the gold amount than low roll it, which is quite nice, and he can get a decent lead from that. He also has a lot more damage on his Q, where the AP ratio has been changed to 100% and the base damage is higher. And he also has more base damage on his E. I'm going to put Twisted Fate in the augment item OP tier, because there are some really nice items with him. He is also very versatile, where you can go for an on-hit build with him. You can go for the stat anvil run on him, which is potentially very powerful, potentially kind of a bait. His biggest downside is similar to Taliyah, where he just doesn't have that great of an ultimate. It just lets him have vision, which, I mean, is very good if you're playing against like Kha'Zix or champions that have invisibility, because then you can actually see them. It's good for getting you towards an enemy champion if they're about to heal from like Power Flower. You can like either steal the Power Flower or try to shut them down. You can try to use it as escape in certain situations, so there is some playability with his ultimate. His single target damage can be very impressive with the right items, with the right augments. But if you're not hitting those good breakpoints, he can feel a bit lackluster because he naturally doesn't have any % health damage. His base damages aren't that high. and he doesn't have any mobility outside of the ultimate, and he can really struggle against champions with a bunch of dashes, champions with a bunch of CC, which is why he's not going any higher. And there are some games where Twisted Fate will actually feel kind of weak, will feel kind of bad, so don't be too surprised if you end up going 8th or see that Twisted Fate Ornn team FF immediately. Veigar is a very frustrating champion to play against in every game mode, because you always have that in the back of the mind. It's like, oh, he's going to hit that 1000 AP breakpoint. He's going to hit all of that AP. He's going to just eventually one-shot me with his ultimate. And that is true with Arena, especially because he also just gets passive AP every round. He can sometimes struggle to stack in the early game. He can definitely feel a lot weaker in the early game, and he is nerfed where his E cooldown is longer and his Q has less AP ratios. All that being considered, he's going in the augment/item OP tier, because if you have any augments or any items that rely on AP scaling, Veigar is the champion that is just going to have the most consistent super duper high AP scaling builds, which is just really annoying to deal with. His ultimate is absolutely annoying as a single target nuke on low health targets. He can be a bit weak against champions with a ton of mobility, against champions that have a bunch of CC, or like champions that are super duper tanky, because if he isn't getting them low enough, his ultimate won't be able to shut them down. But there's gonna be plenty of games where the Veigar just scales to a point where he is so frustrating to play against. And also, Veigar, every single game, always rolls big brain. So he just starts the round with a 3000 shield, which is just absolutely annoying, and I swear it happens every single time. Vel'Koz is another champion I didn't see any buffs or nerfs to, which kind of surprised me, because another champion I think is kind of similar is Vel'Koz, who has a bunch of these buffs and nerfs. Again, the website I'm using could be wrong, and you could have some changes somewhere, so if you do know, please let everybody know in the comments, and I would love to see that. That being said, he's going in the has potential but awkward/hard tier. He can do a bunch of damage because he has that true damage naturally with his passive. He has amazing range if your teammate is able to kite or peel for you. He does really struggle, though, against champions with a bunch of mobility, and with everybody having more movement speed, it is hard for him to land his spells sometimes. So if you're really good at Vel'Koz, he can pop off. But if you're not going to constantly be hitting those Qs on enemies, he can struggle. And he can even struggle against champions with just way too much health. Because sure, Liandry's is nice on him, but sometimes they are just way too tanky that they are able to catch up to you and make sure that you never ever move again. Vex, on the other hand, has a bunch of buffs where she has more health. Her Q does more damage, her W has a lower cooldown, her E has a lower cooldown, and the slow is enhanced. And Vex is a champion that I'm always surprised how well she ends up doing on the leaderboard, and I'm going to put her in the strong tier. I recently played a Vex game where I am a terrible Vex player, but I just was able to constantly proc damage with Liandry's outside Rune Carver, which is absolutely busted. She has good cooldowns, decent range, where she is able to proc those things quite effectively. She also has decent CC. She's good against champions with a lot of dashes, because she has, I believe, like enhanced damage in them, and she gets her fear more often. She can engage or finish off people by using her ultimate, which is nice. So she is a decently versatile champion. And with all of the buffs, she can be quite strong, but similar to a lot of mages, she is rather squishy. She has not the best mobility, pretty much no mobility. So if champions are able to constantly sit on top of her, she will struggle. Viktor's a weird champion because the buffs I have listed for him are the same stats on his main page. So maybe after the rework, the numbers were just the same. I'm not really sure. He does get some natural passive stacks, which then allows him to upgrade his abilities. And I'm going to put Viktor in the decent tier. I do think he's a lot better in Summoner's Rift, where you have like a team around you to help peel for you, to help set you up. You are playing around like chokes more effectively. He does have something similar to Taliyah, where he has that W, but oftentimes champions are still able to just like dash through it in time, flash over it. While Taliyah, like, if they dash, they get stunned, but Viktor, they don't get stunned if they go through it. His damage can be a bit lackluster in Arena until, like, super duper late into the game, because he is the same level as everybody else. Meanwhile, in, like, Summoner's Rift, you just constantly want to be, like, power farming on Viktor, which is just something you can't really do in Arena, and that's why he feels a bit more lackluster than you would expect. He's also like super punishable because he has no mobility and he doesn't have instant hard CC, so you do have to like position really well on Viktor. So if you are super duper good at that, he can maybe be pretty good, but you do have to play him quite well. Vladamir is one of those champions that either like completely pops off or feels honestly kind of mid, and maybe that's because his Q cooldown has been increased a fair amount and the heal AP ratio has also been reduced. He is a very good scaling champion, but he doesn't have the most damage against a lot of tanks unless he has really good augments and items. So I'm actually going to end up putting him in the strong but very nerf tier. He's definitely solid. He can definitely be decent, but if you build anti-heal on him, that can help shut him down. That being said, if he has enough healing, it won't shut him down, and then he'll be an absolute menace. His pool is a very powerful ability, but the cooldown is also long enough that if you have enough burst, as soon as he comes back from the pool, you can blow him up before he gets another empowered Q off. So there is some counterplay to Vladamir. Don't get me wrong, he can be quite strong. He doesn't have the most range though, and he doesn't proc Liandry's as well as a lot of these champions, which is why he is going a bit lower for me. And a lot of these champions have buffs in general, while Vladamir has a nerf, so that's why I'm going to put him a bit lower. Xerath has a billion buffs to all of his abilities, and he has more base health. One thing that's really interesting is that his passive gives him 2 procs on the Power Flower instead of 1. That all being said, increasing his base damage and giving him more stun isn't going to help him from being in the has potential but awkward / hard tier. If you're able to play him really well, if you're able to position perfectly, if your teammate is able to peel for him, he can pump out a lot of damage. He just doesn't naturally have any % health damage, so he can struggle against champions with a bunch of health. He can struggle against bruisers that can get on top of him. He has to like always land his stun. If he doesn't, he's just going to end up being dead. He can also kind of struggle against ADCs with too much range because they will like just shoot him enough times to blow him up. So he has a lot of matchups that he doesn't really love. I guess the best scenario for Xerath would be like his teammate kind of goes in, CCs them, and Xerath is able to pump all of his damage all at once to blow up that target. But if you don't get that to happen, he will definitely feel lackluster. Ziggs is another artillery mage that is heavily buffed, but besides buffing his base damages, they also buffed his AP ratios to pretty high levels. I'm actually going to put him in the strong tier. Some games he's going to feel like an absolute menace, especially because his ultimate just does way more damage, and the cooldown feels pretty low that if he gets some power flowers, he's going to be able to get another ultimate off. It's also a lot easier to land his ultimate than a champion like Xerath, for instance. His W cooldown is almost like halved, I'm pretty sure, so he does have a bit of mobility and a bit of peel, which again is better than the other artillery mages. Now, with all that considered, he still has the exact same problems, that if the enemy champions have too much mobility, if they are too tanky, he can struggle against those. But I do think that the buffs to Ziggs do put him in a state where he is pretty strong as a mage, as a lot of mages are honestly quite strong in Arena. So he's a very annoying champion, and they're going to make her more annoying to deal with. As they just lowered her Q cooldown on this patch, she can absolutely blow people up if she is able to land her sleep and then a nice Q from max range. Now, the thing is, you have to be really good at Zoe to do that, because she has such a unique game pattern where you throw your ability behind you and then you throw it forward, and you want to like combine your ultimate and your flash to give it like more range. So if you're very good at Zoe, she has the potential to deal decent damage to single targets. But at the same time, they do kind of have to be squishy for you to be dealing a bunch of damage. If you are a tank and are able to reach levels of very high health or just building MR in general, Zoe kind of just does no damage to you, and you can just kind of block the projectiles for your other team member. So because of those problems, I'm going to put her in the category of has the potential to be strong, but is awkward and hard because you have to play her really, really well. And her abilities should just be body blocked if you are playing against a strong bruiser or tank. Now, the final champion, Zyra, like Heimerdinger, was absolutely busted at the beginning of Arena, but I don't see any nerfs to her. And at first, I thought that was just absolutely absurd. There has to be nerfs for Zyra somewhere listed. The more I thought about it, I just realized that Zyra has been super duper meta in pro play, and her jungle has been nerfed several times, so maybe Zyra is just naturally weaker because of that compared to when she like first came out in Arena. Now, that's not going to stop me from putting her in the augment / item OP tier, just because she is an absolute menace with items that you just constantly want to be proccing damage, as her plants will be constantly proccing them. She has relatively low cooldowns. Her plants are great at blocking. Projectiles. She's great at controlling chokes, making it uncomfortable for people to fight her. She's so busted with Liandry's that she's one of the best users for it. So without any nerfs to her number, I'm gonna put her in this category. Now that completes my Mage Champion tier list. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave it a like. The next tier list I'll be working on is the Marksman Champion tier list, so make sure to subscribe if you'd be interested in seeing that one. Now, I know the people who are furiously typing in the comments below that I know nothing about the game probably won't be hearing this, but just remember, these are my opinions. If you are doing well on any of the champions I think are kind of weak, then hats off to you. I'm very proud of you. And if you think I'm telling you to constantly play Brand and Malzahar every game, I definitely am not. I hate that I have to play against those champions a lot. Now, that being said, they are very fun to play, so I'm not saying you shouldn't ever play them, but definitely try to experiment, try to have fun, which is the purpose of me making all these tier lists, to give a chance to every single champion, to give you maybe some ideas about what you could do, we could try out, as I think Arena is the perfect game mode to experiment and to have fun on. Anyways, thank you guys all again so much for watching, and best of luck on your Arena adventures.